By the year 1969, everything was falling into place for Russell Price, and archaeological work at Poukawa was gaining scientific acceptance of the highest order. Here is a chronology of significant events that unfolded between the autumn of 1969 through to the summer months, extending through to March of 1970, when a virtually unknown individual called Bruce McFadgen, armed with a diploma in surveying, first comes onto the Poukawa scene. On the 6th of May 1969, before the onset of winter, New Zealand's leading experts in tephra stratigraphy, that's ashband layering, Alan Puller, DSIR Soil Bureau pedologist of Whakatane, and Colin Vucetich of Victoria University Geology Department, in preceding days had visited Russell Price's archaeological sites and identified positively undisturbed bands of ash from the Taupo and Waimahia fallout showers. They were accompanied by H. Wellman and B. Kern, also of the Victoria University Geology Department. On the 10th of October 1969, Russell Price wrote to Dr. Athol Rafter announcing that we now have an almost perfect lineup of stakes and post holes, all sealed over by the Taupo ash for a distance of 51 feet. That's something approaching 16 meters, indicating that these early people were in occupation for a considerable period of time. Our chances of recovering human remains of this period have now increased 1,000%. Price went on to mention that large quantities of marked moa bones, together with 107 pieces of moa eggshell, sawn into giant moa bones, charcoal collected from a dump of marked up moa bones resting 1 inch above the Waimahia ash, marked up moa bones and a very large vertebrae were recovered immediately under this dump, 4 clear inches below the Waimahia ash, with charcoal both small and large pieces together, with marked moa bone peeping out from under the M12 balk line. On the 20th of October 1969, Dr. Athol Rafter wrote to Russell Price, questioning why were there anomalous, confusing results related to the C14 ages obtained for dig position 2476-6. On the 28th of October 1969, Russell Price wrote a detailed answer back to Dr. Rafter and provided a drawing explaining what had gone wrong with this low-lying position. It had been under lake water until drainage of the lake in 1931, and in the intervening 38 years the peat lake bed had dried out and cracked, allowing modern surface materials, snails, shells, sheep bones, stones, etc., to tumble down to marginally lower levels where they had not originally been in permanent situ. This occurrence was of sufficient concern that Dr. Rafter organised an expedition of a group of New Zealand's leading experts in their fields to do an in-depth analysis of the archaeological dig sites at Poukawa. It had to be ascertained that the permanently above-ground areas of excavation, especially the tephra ash bands, were sealed and undisturbed. On the 29th of October 1969, Dr. Athol Rafter released the C14 results for samples collected by W.A. Puller, pedologist, Soil Bureau, Whakatane, showing date ranges for items and organic matter sealed in situ just below the Taupo and Waimahia ash bands. These ash stratification bases delivered up C14 results for 1900 years beneath Taupo and 3400 years beneath Waimahia, respectively. On the 5th of November 1969, leading New Zealand Soil Bureau scientist W.A. Puller wrote to T.L. Grant Taylor, New Zealand Geological Survey, verifying that the Taupo and Waimahia ash bands of the Poukawa Valley had been positively identified and conclusively proven beyond dispute. Again on the 5th of November 1969, on the same day, Price sent Dr. Athol Rafter photo enlargements of the new post-hole evidence showing sealed, undisturbed Taupo ash sitting atop obvious ancient post holes in place before the ash fell. Residues of the decayed post was in place, sufficient for C14 testing of the organic matter. On November 20th and 21st, 1969, Dr. Rafter, Mr. Gibbs, Dr. Fleming, that is Sir Charles Fleming, New Zealand's most eminent geologist, and other leading scientists paid a visit to Price to check all the on-site evidence, discuss the archaeological position, and advise what methods would be needed to establish the facts. From a copious assortment of evidence, accrued over at least a decade of archaeological digs, Price was able to prove very ancient human occupation within the Poukawa Valley, spanning many thousands of years. Incidentally, Harry Gibbs was one of the founding members of the Department of Earth Sciences, along with Professors John McCraw and Michael Selby. On the 3rd of April 1970, the November 20th, 21st visit by New Zealand's leading scientists in their several separate fields or disciplines resulted in the creation of a report on the 3rd of April 1970, one copy of which bore the title Statement of Belief, restricted, not for publication. It is known from the above copy held by author John Tasker of Hastings, Hawke's Bay, New Zealand, that a group of leading scientists in attendance at Price's archaeological dig sites on the 21st of November 1969 signed their affirmation that Price's findings were scientifically proven. Tasker, in deference to the wishes of the signatories, will only divulge the names of two of the scientists that appear in his copy, as they had died by the time he wrote his book. Here is the actual text of the Statement of Belief, as found in Dr. Athol Rafter's personal files. It was released under an Official Information Act request.
Statement of Belief. Poukawa Archaeological Site R2476. Introduction. This site, being investigated by Mr. Russell Price of Hastings, has figured in newspapers and popular periodicals from time to time. The reports have appeared so radical that considerable doubts of reporting accuracy have been raised in the minds of scientific readers. The data Mr. Price has slowly accumulated, however, has demonstrated that the results have to be taken seriously. W.A. Puller of Soil Bureau Whakatane visited the site earlier this year, examined ash layers contained within peat, and collected radiocarbon samples from above and below the ash layers. The dates from these confirmed his identifications of the Taupo and Waimahia pumice ashes. On November 20 to 21, Dr. Rafter, Mr. Gibbs, Dr. Fleming and I paid a flying visit to Price to see his evidence, discuss the archaeological position, and advise what methods would be needed to establish his story. The site is on a low, 10-foot ridge, a matter of 2 chains wide, extending into Old Lake Poukawa. A number of similar ridges and islands, some smaller, some larger, are in the general area. The original discovery was of a near-surface Maori occupation, revealed by ploughing bones and artefacts to the surface. The bones included extinct goose and eagle, Notornis, moa, etc., etc., and are present in great quantity. We saw from the superficial layer artefacts of typical classic Maori character, including minute 1-inch greenstone chisels, longer chisels in greenstone and axite, a green sandstone patu fragment, Jurassic greywacke, etc., large quantities of bone articles, tattooing chisels, needles, awls, etc., uncompleted shellfish hook. A beautifully carved bone needle is ornamented with a generalised human face of Mania type. The midden material included locally derived concretions, oven stones, hierodella, some alleged to be enormous, 4 to 5 inches, power and bone. The whole surface accumulation suggested a typical Maori site. Ash showers. The ridge, dry and unpeaty on top, carries a thick wedge of peaty soil on each side. Within this peat are 2 pumice layers. The lower, about 1.5 inches thick, has a sand-size lower half and a fine silt-sized upper. In the exposures, we saw it was entirely ear-laid. About a foot above this rhyolite ash horizon is a second layer of coarse, grit-sized rhyolite pumice lapilli. This is only about 1/4 of an inch thick in the higher parts of the wedge, but is irregularly thickened lower down. In these lower parts, the bulk of the lapilli are rounded and the thickening is clearly due to transport of lapilli by water, perhaps lake water. In the higher parts, the lapilli are angular and occur with sand and dust-grade particles, and is clearly ear-laid, although continuous with the water-laid part. These 2 volcanic layers have been identified by W.A. Puller of Soil Bureau as Waimahia circa 3,200 years ago and Taupo circa 1,800 years ago. And the identification is confirmed by carbon datings of peat from above and below each layer. Neither ash is continuous right over the ridge, but the Taupo laps on further than the Waimahia. The relationships of both show that erosion has partially removed each layer from the ridge crest. Relationships of artefacts to the ash showers. The more sophisticated material, in large quantity, is characteristic of Maori and reported to be confined to the layer above the Taupo shower. Below the Taupo shower, the material is less plentiful and includes flaked stone tools, but no polished stone implements. The largest we saw was a greywacke chopper, 4 inches across, with a broad back edge and a sharp front edge. 2 peaked areas made convenient thumb holds for 2 holding positions. The sharper edge had been blunted by use. Bone needles and awls have been recovered from various levels, from just below the Taupo to well below the Waimahia and even into the inorganic alluvium. Moa bones that had been sawn or that bear notches made by sandstone saws have been found below ash showers. The notched bones show sawing marks, and these are present on the face of the stratigraphically lowest artefact, an awl or dagger from a leg bone of a bird, not moa, with a point produced by an obliquely cut face. There are several bones, both moa and other birds, with similar oblique cut marks. Bones show an aging patina, and this is present on these artefacts. Moa limb bones at all horizons have had their articulatory surfaces broken off, as if to expose the marrow. The bones are strong and could not have been broken naturally. In addition to the above, there are post holes at various levels. We saw in one of the balks 12-inch unexcavated strips between excavated squares, a section through an old post hole. This hole had been made by a sharpened post driven into the ground. The post was around 4 inches in diameter, had rotten off, and the hole then infilled before the Taupo ash fell. The Taupo lapillis, here a thickened water-laid horizon, but apparently continuous with air-laid lapilli elsewhere and at the same depth, was continuous across the top of the post infilling. Similar post holes are reported below the Waimahia ash, with continuous ash across the top. The post hole we saw has every appearance of being undisturbed, and convincingly demonstrates human occupation of the site prior to the Taupo shower. The discoveries of artefacts and ovens alleged to lie below one or other of the ash showers gives a similar demonstration. It did not appear possible for the post-hole scene to be formed subsequent to the Taupo shower, or to have been a recent construction. Samples of the infilling were collected in two parts: A, top 2.5 inches, B, lower 6 inches. The infilling is sufficiently carbonaceous to give a carbon date. The dates of the two parts should be similar and precede the Taupo shower. Unfortunately, there was no remnant of the original post. Reconstructed setting. Although the surrounding ground is now drained in Maori times, it was lake with knobs and ridges rising above swamp. The ridges appear to be composed of shallow water-marine pumiceous muds, sands and derived fragmental limestones that are characteristic fillings in the tectonic depression. These sediments are presumed, on not very adequate grounds, to be of Castle Cliffian age. There was apparently a considerable season fluctuation in water level, and an extensive swampy area, most of it filled with raupo. For one reason or another, the western side at one time supported a quite dense growth of trees, the stumps of which have become exposed in more recent time by draining and shrinkage of peat. Tree stumps are not a feature of the eastern side, which since the area first became waterlogged has probably not been dry for any substantial period until European time. Tectonic deformation may account for this difference. The water and swamp area apparently supported bird life rich in numbers and species, and these appear to have been a major part of the attraction to man. The damming of the valley was caused by the post-glacial aggradation of the Heretaunga Plains due to sea level rise. Peat accumulation probably commenced at this site at or close to the culmination of post-glacial sea level rise, resting on old fans graded to a lower local base level. Conclusions. Occupation of this site has continued over a long period. If the artefacts found have not shifted through the section, the older occupation appears to have commenced prior to the commencement of peat formation, and hence also before the water level of ancient Lake Poukawa had reached its highest level. If the rate of peat formation has been substantially uniform, peats commenced forming at about post-glacial sea level maximum, say 4,500 years ago. The stratigraphically lowest discoveries lie below this peat and may conceivably predate circa 4,500 years ago. The site demonstrates human occupation of this area of much greater antiquity than anything previously anticipated. It does not yet, however, demonstrate anything about the ethnological relationships of the early inhabitants and the later Maoris, although the stratigraphically lowest material is all of a flaked nature. Artifacts of this type are cosmopolitan and persisted in the Neolithic cultures, so do not necessarily indicate a Paleolithic culture. No human bone remains have yet been found below unbroken Taupo pumice. This site also raises the probability that other sites, possibly in similar lacustrine environments, are awaiting discovery, not only here but elsewhere in New Zealand. Best techniques for excavation are probably different from those used up to the present.
On the 17th of March 1970, Bruce McFadgen wrote a report about a visit he had made to Russell Price only 2 days before to examine Price's evidence. On the 23rd of March 1970, Dr. Athol Rafter wrote a letter to Russell Price in which he said, "However, things are moving in your favour. You seem to have won another convert in B.G. McFadgen. He spoke most enthusiastically to me about your work after returning from Poukawa and seems to be convinced that man was in New Zealand pre-Taupo." Here's what Bruce McFadgen wrote on the 17th of March 1970.
released under the Official Information Act, B.G. McFadden, Poukawa. On Sunday, March 15th, 1970, I visited Mr. T.R. Price at Poukawa. The object of my visit was to examine his evidence for the antiquity of man in New Zealand. In particular, I wanted to investigate the alleged post holes and artefacts said to have been found beneath the Waimahia and Taupo ash layers. Upon arriving at Poukawa, Mr. Price showed me colour slides, black and white photographs, and a diagram of the site stratigraphy. After looking at these for about an hour and a half, we went across to the site to look at the exposed sections. We stayed there for about an hour, while he pointed out the ash layers and several post holes. We then left the site and went to his home in Hastings, where I was shown some of the bone material and artefacts recovered from the site. Post holes beneath the Waimahia ash layer. The post holes allegedly beneath this layer were shown to me in a colour slide. There was no evidence from the colour slide of the ash layer passing unbroken over the top of the post holes. Upon questioning Mr. Price, it was found that the Waimahia ash layer, which was not continuous over the site, terminated about 3 feet from the post holes. The top of the post holes were at about the same level as the ash layer. Post holes beneath the Taupo ash layer. The post holes allegedly beneath this layer were also shown to me in colour slides. Of the 3 post holes in question, one appeared to be cut through the Taupo ash layer, and almost certainly is younger than the ash layer. The other 2 post holes, however, were cut from a level about 6 inches below the Taupo ash and sealed by a yellow deposit about 8 inches thick. The Taupo ash layer was indicated in this yellow deposit by a trowel placed about 6 inches above the 2 post holes. The colour difference between the ash and the yellow layer was not sufficiently marked to be able to trace the ash layer above the post holes in the slide, but Mr. Price was sure that it passed over the top of both post holes. The yellow layer showed no sign of disturbance, and since the greater part of this layer sealed the post holes, it must be concluded that the post holes predate the Taupo ash shower. The positions of the post holes in plan were not shown to me, although some at least are in a straight line. Which ones were not specified. Artefacts beneath the Waimahia ash layer. A number of pieces of work bone are said to have been recovered from beneath the Waimahia ash layer. Modification to the bone included file marks, a groove about 2 inches long and a 1/16 of an inch wide, and deep cut into a bone, and pieces of bone which had been sawn into 2 or more pieces. Of the dozen or so pieces of work bone I saw, all showed signs of workmanship which under normal archaeological circumstances would not be questioned as being human. Dr. Yaldwin of the Dominion Museum has also seen the bones in question, and he is of the opinion that the markings are not natural. He is unaware of similar markings occurring on bones found in a natural context. The bones showing signs of modification all appeared to be moa bone. The bones mentioned above I saw at Mr. Price's home. I did not see any slides or photographs of these in situ. Mr. Price does not appear to be in any doubt that they were recovered from beneath the Waimahia ash. The ash layer is about 2 inches thick and easily recognised. Mr. Price seems to be well aware of the significance of his finds and appears to have taken some pains to ensure he knows from what layer his finds originate. His somewhat unorthodox methods of excavation were apparently adopted to facilitate this. He seems to be aware of the possibility of disturbances in the soil, particularly post holes, and the need to detect these. He seems to be satisfied that his methods have enabled him to place his finds and detect disturbances. Additional finds beneath the Waimahia ash include what Mr. Price has called a hearth or fireplace. This was a blackened area thought to be caused by fire and associated with a number of bones. It was quite limited in extent, being 2 or 3 feet in diameter. It had been photographed, but from the photograph it was not clear what the relationship of the feature was with the Waimahia ash, there being no stratigraphic link left to tie it in to the baulk of the square. Artefacts beneath the Taupo ash layer. The artefacts alleged to have come from beneath the Taupo ash layer include drilled and polished bone and flake material. One piece of flake material was flint, from which had been struck a blade about 3 inches long and half an inch wide. There is no doubt that this material is artefactual. The levels of the site above the Taupo ash layer are complex, and the archaeological origin of the upper layers does not appear to have been adequately explained. The Taupo layer itself is not continuous over the site and rises and falls frequently. It was found to be difficult to detect in plan, although in section it seemed to be quite clear. Method. The method adopted to excavate the site was the vertical face method of excavation. It was adopted initially to facilitate the location of the Taupo ash and to place finds as above or below it. The site itself appears to have been properly laid out with a grid of approximately 10-foot squares. All material recovered from the site has been labelled and recorded in notebooks. Data recorded included square number and layer. The few record books I saw appeared to be well kept. I gained the impression that Mr. Price was reasonably careful and methodical. Discussion. There appears to be little doubt that the artefacts Mr. Price claims to have found beneath the Waimahia ash are man-made. Bearing in mind the limitations of the vertical face method of excavation, the critical question concerns the validity of the association of the artefacts with the pre-Waimahia ash layers. No disturbances were mentioned by Mr. Price, nor did I see any in his sections which could explain the dragging down of material to below the Waimahia ash. The absence of imported stone or other artefacts in the pre-Waimahia levels is puzzling, but also argues against the dragging down of material. The upper levels of the site contained stone tools and finished bone tools, none of which appeared in the lower levels. On the other hand, the possibility of disturbance cannot be completely ruled out. The possibility of disturbance dragging material below the Taupo layer is more likely, since this layer is close to the ground surface and the layer itself difficult to detect. Mr. Price, however, was aware of the difficulties connected with this layer and seems to have taken considerable care to detect the Taupo ash layer and place correctly his finds in relation to it. The evidence for pre-Taupo post holes seems to be reasonably firm, albeit only 2 have been found so far. The upper layers are, however, complex, and when their archaeological origin is adequately explained, the above interpretation may be altered. There is no evidence for post holes beneath the Waimahia ash. Conclusions. The implications of the Poukawa site are sufficiently important for the site to warrant an independent assessment by trained archaeologists. The evidence as it stands is not clear-cut, but some of the ambiguity could be eliminated by a more rigorous control over the excavation and the application of more modern techniques. The site is not only important archaeologically, but I believe is of some importance to zoologists. The nature of the site requires the presence of a geologist, and possibility a soil scientist and zoologist, as well as an archaeologist, should a thorough investigation be independently undertaken. 17th of March 1970.
So on the 23rd of March 1970, Bruce McFadyen went and met with Dr. Athol Rafter and enthusiastically supported Price's conclusions. So now let's look at some of the manoeuvres and statements of Bruce McFadyen after that time. In November of 1969, a group of the most eminent and respected New Zealand scientists at the head of their disciplines had done an inspection of Price's archaeological dig sites. This inspection came on the heels of many years of accrued evidence that could not be scientifically denied, marginalised or explained away. Exhaustive efforts by the best minds of the country, their sophisticated laboratories and testing equipment, plus on-site observations had been applied in order to verify the validity of the results. For the majority of the preceding 5 years at least, the DSIR Radiocarbon Laboratory, under the direction of Dr. Athol Rafter, had been C14 testing carefully bagged samples of organic matter, including cooked and broken, cut-sawn moa bones and other ancient bird species, Hierodella freshwater mussel shells or post-hole wood residues, etc., and dating the samples or man-made artifacts to a remote antiquity in age. The results were the product of many highly trained staff overseeing the careful processes of age testing and were beyond reproach or question. The C14 testing activity was at the leading edge of scientific achievement at the time. Supporting the above effort were on-site experts in volcanology and layering of tephra ash fallout from ancient volcanic explosions, the dates of which were well known, or the stratigraphic layering signatures easily identified in soil cross-sections. If human-made or utilised objects and artefacts were found to lie beneath undisturbed bands of volcanic ash, the inescapable conclusion was that they had been deposited and lain there since before the ash fell. DSIR Soil Bureau personnel of several disciplines worked on Russell Price's sites in the capacities of tephrochronology, geology or agronomy, observing stratifications, analysing artefacts and bagging samples for laboratory testing. Beyond these groups were credentialed archaeologists, zoologists, ornithologists or marine biologists, ichthyologists studying the fish and crustacean environment of Poukawa Lake. All of the essential expertise had been in place off and on, as necessity dictated, for a considerable period, which caused the scientists to state, "The data Mr. Price has slowly accumulated, however, has demonstrated that the results have to be taken seriously." Which begs the question, why does McFadyen's report, conclusion of the 17th of March 1970, end with a recommendation that trained archaeologists using modern techniques, along with geologists, soil scientists and zoologists, become involved? McFadyen was a 27-year-old new boy on the block with a diploma in surveying and seems to have been somewhat out of touch with the years of scientifically backed endeavour supporting Price's work at Poukawa. In McFadyen's March 1970 report, he questions the evidence of post holes under unbroken Waimea ash, as shown to him. However, the group of New Zealand's leading scientists who visited Price's sites 4 months previously were unanimous that several post holes did indeed exist under at least undisturbed Taupo ash fallout. They stated, "Similar post holes are reported below the Waimea ash with continuous ash across the top. The post hole we saw has every appearance of being undisturbed and convincingly demonstrates human occupation of the site prior to the Taupo shower. The discovery of artifacts and ovens alleged to lie below one or other of the ash showers gives a similar demonstration." McFadyen concurred on the same point and also stated, "There appears to be little doubt that the artifacts Mr. Price claims to have found beneath the Waimea ash are man-made." This fact was supported by McFadyen's own statement in his report, wherein he wrote, "Dr. Yaldwin of the Dominion Museum has also seen the bones in question, and he is of the opinion that the markings are not natural. He is unaware of similar markings occurring on bones found in a natural context." Despite being essentially convinced that Price was 100% correct, he still left the door slightly ajar as to the very unlikely possibility of objects in higher or surface strata being dragged down by some inexplicable means to much lower levels beneath the Taupo and Waimahia ash bands. The improbability of this ever having happened was laid to rest by the group of New Zealand's leading experts in their fields who inspected the sites in late November 1969. Although they touched upon the remote possibility of items migrating from the surface downwards, they quickly discounted it. They cited evidence that no observable or detectable disturbances to the ash layers, as well as plausible C14 findings and date ranges for levels above and below the ash bands, everything was intact. They cited evidence of no observable or detectable disturbance to the ash layers, as well as plausible C14 findings and date ranges for levels above and below the ash bands. Everything was intact. On the subject matter related to lack of disturbance leading to fissures through the levels, McFadyen was even more specific, citing several layers of evidence as to why this had never happened. Was McFadyen sincere at this time, or was he simply trying to enter into the good graces of the scientific in-crowd who were poised to make a dynamic breakthrough in the rewriting of New Zealand's long-term history? Within about 3 years beyond 1970, McFadyen, for all his alleged enthusiasm in support of Russell Price's findings, was on a very different tack, more inclined towards torpedoing Price's 25 years of archaeological endeavour and the set-in-concrete conclusions of the scientific community that had rigorously tested Price's sites. As flimsy and scientifically unsupportable as his argument was, McFadyen would hang his hopes on pushing the concept that the 1931 earthquake had totally jumbled the terrain of the Poukawa Valley, cracking everything and rendering all the terrain topsy-turvy, thus mixing late-era strata, artefacts and human occupation evidence down into the very ancient strata beds. What he needed to do to pull off this ruse was to show some cracking somewhere, and the only recorded region where cracking was in evidence was in the dried-out lake bottom peat that had shrunk in the intervening 38 years since 1931. This is all he could offer up in support of his ridiculous hypothesis. Knowing from Price's October 1969 letter to Dr. Rafter that he would positively find cracked peat only a foot or so under the former lake bed, in an area down by the fence line, at the outer edge of Price's archaeological site at 2476-6, McFadyen chose to dig there. Note how beautifully manicured his cracked peat appears to be in the photograph. The excavation has been very carefully undertaken, so as to not disturb the top surface of the peat, which has been swept or virtually vacuumed to expose the deep fissures due to shrinkage. This appears to have been the whole purpose of the exercise. Show cracks, which, by innuendo and misrepresentation, is designed to suggest that all subterranean in the Poukawa Valley at all levels was similarly affected. Here is a document trail. It's only a small sample of the letters, exchanges, C14 results, etc. that were exchanged between Russell Price, Athol Rafter and others in mainly 1969 through 1970. These documents were received under an Official Information Act request, and they are, for the most part, over 50 years old. Here's a sample dated 11th May 1968. and the heavily edited document that follows it below is directly derived from the document above. But this second document is stripped of all the pertinent information the public is now not allowed to know or see because it is censored and the results need to be sterilised for public consumption. Whereas this second C14 set of results found on the New Zealand radiocarbon database have been severely McFudged and tampered with to hide the much more comprehensive information that was found on the original source document, this one slipped under the radar and shows that humans have been in New Zealand since at least 2,285 years before 1950. The abbreviation CRA means Conventional Radiocarbon Age. And guess who's in charge of the University of Waikato Radiocarbon Dating Unit and the New Zealand Radiocarbon Database? Yup, Bruce McFudgeon. This sample was collected on the 23rd of October 1965, given its final C14 test on the 13th of February 1970, and produced a finalised reading of 7,170 years, plus or minus 60 years before 1950. In a document dated the 23rd of March 1970, is a sample recorded as one broken femur, sawn into by man. This was dated to 7,170 years plus or minus 60 years before 1950 in actual age. This moa bone was positively identified to have been sawn into by humans. Here is one of the letters in the DSIR file that speaks about the specimen from which the 7,170 years plus or minus 60 years date was derived.
The text shown reads Poukawa, Hawke's Bay, 2nd of September, R2476. Dear Phil, I do apologise for taking so long to answer your letter. It's been the reference to the circa 5,000 year carbon date from Poukawa which has caused the problem, and the problem is still not solved. I can't track down the reference. I think it was in a report put out by the nuclear lab of the DSIR. Anyway, details of the date I can tell you. The date of 5,180 plus or minus 70 years before 1950 was obtained from giant moa bone, Dinornis giganteus or Hercules, from Poukawa Site 3. The bone was dated because one of the pelvic pubes was found to have a deep cut across it. We have also obtained an older date for moa bone from Site 1, that being 7170 plus or minus 70 before 1950. A deep diagonal cut across the femur of this bird suggested. The second part of the letter seems to have been lost.